There are places in England that exist only in rumour, villages unmarked on maps, known only to those whose families once lived there. Millersville was one such place. In 1893, it stood on the border between Hampshire and Dorset, a quiet settlement of cobbled streets, timber-framed houses, and a modest church whose bell could be heard for miles. The census of that year listed just over 400 residents. By the next, there were none. The official record states that the town was disbanded after a local disaster. No further explanation was ever given, but the story of Millersville did not vanish entirely. It survived in whispers, in old letters, and in the fading memory of those whose ancestors were there for the event that ended the town, the wedding that became a massacre. The Whitmore-Carow wedding was meant to be the grandest celebration the region had ever seen. The bride, Margaret Whitmore, was the daughter of a wealthy landowner who had recently purchased property in the area, an elegant manor just beyond the town's edge. The groom, Thomas Carow, was a respected merchant's son, known for his charm and ambition. Invitations were sent weeks in advance, not just to the townspeople, but to surrounding parishes. The entire population was expected to attend. For days leading up to the event, Millersville transformed. Bunting hung across the streets, tables were built in the square, barrels of cider rolled in from nearby farms. It was said the town had never seen such joy. The ceremony was to be held in the church at noon on the 14th of June. The morning began clear and warm. Witness accounts, and what few remain, describe laughter, music, the ringing of bells. The bride was radiant in white silk, her veil trimmed with gold thread. The groom looked proud, his arms steady as he led her down the aisle. Everything seemed perfect, until the moment the priest began to speak. A man named Reverend Samuel Beck, newly appointed to the parish, officiated that day. His journal, recovered decades later by his successor, provides the only first-hand testimony of what occurred inside the church before it fell silent. At the exchange of vows, he wrote, "I felt the air grow heavy. The candles flickered, though there was no wind. I looked upon the couple and saw their eyes had changed, not with emotion, but with something deeper, colder. I heard the bride whisper a phrase I did not understand, though I have since seen it written, 'Blood remembers blood.'" At that, several among the congregation began to murmur, their voices joining hers. And then a sound, like thunder, though it came from beneath the floor. The Reverend's writing ends mid-sentence. The rest is reconstructed from the accounts of those who fled the church. Witnesses described a sudden tremor that shook the building, knocking dust from the rafters. A child screamed and chaos erupted. The groom collapsed, clutching his chest. Then the doors slammed shut from the inside. By the time help arrived, it was over. Every soul within the church was dead. The coroner's report, dated June 17, 1893, lists the cause as mass asphyxiation due to unknown vapors. Yet the details contradict that conclusion. The bodies were found seated, many in prayerful positions, their faces peaceful, unmarked. The bride and groom were discovered hand in hand before the altar, a small wound on each of their palms, as though they had cut themselves and pressed their hands together. Strangest of all was what the doctor noted next. There is no sign of decay, no odor. The blood within the veins appears preserved, thickened but warm. He refused to continue the autopsy. Within days, fear spread through the region. Travelers avoided the road to Millersville. The town constable requested aid from London, but no officials ever arrived. Letters went unanswered. Then the disappearances began. The first was Mary Elcott, a seamstress who had sewn the bride's gown. She was found in her cottage, still seated before her sewing machine, her body stiff, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Next was Edgar Rook, the gravedigger. He vanished from his post, leaving the cemetery gate open and a lantern still burning beside a half-dug grave. By midsummer, the town's population had dwindled by half. Those who fled spoke of strange sounds at night, music echoing faintly from the empty church, though its doors were locked and boarded. Others said they saw figures walking the lanes after dusk, men and women in wedding clothes, faces pale as wax, moving in pairs. Hand in hand, a London journalist named Arthur Linton visited Millersville in August, hoping to document what remained. His report, printed briefly in the Illustrated Chronicle before being retracted, reads like fiction. Yet its details match other independent testimonies. The town is empty, yet the houses are clean, the tables set. There is food still upon the plates. I entered one parlour and found tea laid for two, steam still rising though the pot was cold. The church is sealed with boards and nails, but the wood trembles. At times I hear voices within, repeating the same words again and again, a vow, a prayer perhaps. And from the graveyard I hear the tolling of a bell that no longer hangs. The article was withdrawn 2 days after publication. Linton himself disappeared shortly after returning to London. His belongings were found in his rented room, including a notebook containing only 3 words, written over and over. The pact endures. By the end of the year, Millersville had ceased to exist. Maps were redrawn, its parish records erased. The land was sold quietly to a private estate. When census officers returned in 1895, the area was listed as uninhabited pasture land, and so it was, for a time. But the few who lived nearby claimed that on certain nights, when the wind carried from the east, they could still hear the church bell ringing faintly across the fields. In 1911, a team of railway surveyors discovered what they believed to be the remains of Millersville beneath the overgrowth. Their findings, later sealed under government order, described the entire town as if it had been frozen. Food untouched on tables, candles unburned, a clock still ticking in the manor house, its gears rusted but intact, and in the church, the pews were empty, but the floor was stained dark in the shape of a ring. Within that ring, carved deeply into the stone, were words written in Latin, sanguis promittit memoriam, blood promises remembrance. But what was the promise? And what really happened that June afternoon, when a wedding turned into a massacre and a town erased itself from history? Those answers would not begin to emerge until decades later, when a forgotten journal was discovered in the ruins. And the name of Margaret Whitmore appeared once more, for the truth of Millersville was not lost, it was waiting. It would take more than half a century before anyone dared set foot inside the ruins of Millersville again. By the 1950s, the story had been reduced to a fireside tale, a superstition told by locals to frighten children. Maps from the Ministry of Works marked the land simply as abandoned property. Only the foundations of the church remained visible, half swallowed by the earth, but the past, as ever, resists burial. In the summer of 1954, a team of archaeology students from King's College received permission to conduct a small excavation near the old parish boundary. The leader of the group, Dr. Edward Harland, was fascinated by disappeared settlements, villages lost to plague or migration. He expected little more than pottery shards and forgotten tombs. Instead, he found a diary. The journal was discovered inside what had once been the Whitmore residence, the manor beyond the edge of town. Its structure had collapsed, but beneath a fallen beam, a chest remained intact. Inside were decayed linens, a cracked music box, and a small, leather-bound book tied with a faded ribbon. The first page read, "The Private Writings of Margaret Whitmore, June 1893. Harland's notes, later confiscated, survive only in fragments, enough to piece together the shape of what he found. Margaret's early entries were ordinary. Preparations for her wedding, notes about dress fittings, details of guests and flowers. She wrote of her excitement, her love for Thomas Carow, and the sense that her marriage would lift Millersville into prosperity. But as the pages progressed, the tone changed. Father insists we keep the ceremony small, but the entire town expects to attend. He says there are vows beyond what the church will witness, that blood must answer blood. He gave me a ring that is not gold. It feels warm when I hold it. Last night I dreamed of the church. The candles burned blue. The priest's mouth moved, but no words came out. When I awoke, my hand was bleeding. Thomas says he hears them too, voices when he sleeps, whispering the phrase Father taught us. Sanguis promittit memoriam. He says it means unity. I do not believe him. The final entries are nearly unreadable, scrawled in ink that had darkened almost to brown. But one sentence, underlined twice, remains legible. We made the promise. The door will not open. Dr. Harland took the diary back to London for study. Within weeks, he began suffering from severe insomnia and tremors. He told colleagues that he heard music, faint, like a wedding march, coming from the pages themselves. On the 12th of November, Harland was found dead in his study. His body collapsed beside the open diary. The coroner ruled it heart failure. His assistant, John Penley, later claimed that before authorities arrived, he saw something unusual. The ink on the pages was fresh, glistening wet. Though the air was dry, the diary was confiscated by the Ministry of the Interior under the Heritage Protection Act, citing cultural sensitivity. It was never seen again. For decades, the Millersville incident remained a footnote, an oddity of folklore and forgotten bureaucracy. But fragments of Harland's research circulated quietly through academic circles. Among them was a single translated page from Margaret's journal, labeled The Blood Pact. It read, "The pact was older than us, older than the town. My father said our land was once part of a covenant, a promise made to the earth to keep it fertile, to keep death away. Each generation gave a life in return. When the church was built, they sealed the covenant in stone. But father wished to end it. He said love could replace sacrifice. So we made the vow together, Thomas and I, our blood joined before the altar, so no one else would be taken. We did not understand that the land would claim everyone. Historians dismissed it as myth, an allegory perhaps for rural hysteria or collective grief. But others saw the phrase, the land would claim everyone, as literal. The ground beneath Millersville had long been unstable, riddled with shallow caverns. Some believed the town had collapsed into one such sinkhole, its disappearance an accident exaggerated by rumor. But if that were true, why did later surveys show no sign of geological disturbance? And why, in aerial photographs from 1962, did faint circular patterns appear in the soil where the church once stood, as though something beneath were pressing upward? In 1977, a journalist named Clara Densmore began investigating what she called the Lost Wedding. Her research, published posthumously in the Silent Parish papers, included interviews with surviving descendants of Millersville residents. One, a farmer named Henry Cottam, recalled stories passed down from his grandmother, a girl who had escaped the massacre. She said she ran when the floor shook, hid in the woods till dawn. When she went back, the town was quiet, but she saw them all, every person standing in the street, still as statues, hands clasped. The bride and groom stood before the church doors, smiling. The air smelled of iron. Densmore's notes end abruptly after she wrote that passage. Her body was found in her home a week later. Natural causes, the report said. But her typewriter still held the final unfinished line of her manuscript. It never ended. It only moved. That phrase puzzled researchers for years. Moved where? The answer may lie in a small village called Halewick, 20 miles north of the original Millersville site. In 1983, construction workers unearthed a buried foundation identical to the Millersville church. Same layout, same dimensions. At its center was a circular stone engraved with the same Latin phrase, Sanguis promittit memoriam. No records show a church ever existing there, and yet residents of Halewick had their own local superstition that every 20 years a wedding bell sounds from nowhere and dogs begin to howl. The last recorded occurrence? June 14th, 1983, 90 years to the day after the Millersville Massacre. In the archives of the Hampshire Historical Society, there is one final item connected to the case, a letter sent anonymously in 1994. Written on yellowed stationery and signed only with the initials MW, it reads, "The promise was made to protect life, not destroy it. But when they broke it, the land demanded balance." The bloodline continues. "When the bell rings again, we will answer. Whatever truly happened in Millersville was not confined to the past. The diary, the graves, the symbols, all pointed to a lineage of those who carried the pact forward, bound by blood to an ancient covenant. And if the curse traveled through generations, then perhaps, somewhere in England, the descendants of Margaret Whitmore still live, unaware that their wedding day may already be written." By the early 1990s, the story of Millersville had all but disappeared from public memory. The land where it once stood had been quietly absorbed into farmland, its name erased from road signs. To most, it was a myth, an exaggerated ghost story from Victorian England. But in March of 1993, a researcher named Dr. Amelia Rowe, a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Reading, stumbled across the legend while cataloguing rural superstition archives. Her attention was drawn not by the massacre itself, but by a curious consistency, reports of faint bells, unrecorded churches, and forgotten villages across the same region, all recurring in intervals of roughly 20 years. She began mapping them. The results formed a perfect circle. At its center was the field where Millersville once stood. Dr. Rowe had a reputation for her precision and skepticism. She was not interested in ghost stories, only patterns. But the more she investigated, the more the rational explanations collapsed. On the 12th of May, 1993, she drove to the Millersville site to conduct a soil study. Her assistant, Daniel Price, later gave an account of what occurred that day. "We arrived around noon. The area was silent. No birds, no wind. Dr. Rowe took samples near the center of the old church foundation. The ground was firm, unnaturally so, almost like stone beneath the grass. She placed the samples in containers and then froze. She said she heard something under the soil, a vibration, faint but rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock." He paused before adding, "It wasn't a clock." That night, Rowe began experiencing what she described in her notebook as auditory intrusions. She heard music, faint, distant, a tune she couldn't place at first. When she played it on the piano, her husband recognized it instantly. It was the wedding march. Rowe dismissed it as stress. But over the following weeks, she grew increasingly paranoid. In her final recorded entry, dated June 13, 1993, she wrote, "I dreamt of a church without doors. Everyone inside was still. When I woke, the clock read 11:58. Tomorrow marks exactly 100 years. She never wrote again." On the morning of June 14, 1993, at precisely noon, the small village of Hallowick reported hearing a single peal of bells echoing from the south, though the nearest church lay 5 miles away. Dr. Rowe was found that evening in her car, parked beside the old Millersville field. The engine was running. The radio played static. She appeared asleep in the driver's seat, but her hands were clasped tightly, palms pressed together, each marked with a small circular wound. The event reignited public fascination with Millersville. Local journalists dubbed it the return of the bell, but one detail never reached print. Among Rowe's possessions was a camera. Inside it, investigators found a single undeveloped roll of film. When processed, it revealed 3 images: the overgrown foundation of the church, the cracked stone at its center, a faint outline, barely visible, of figures standing in the mist arranged in pairs, as if posing for a photograph. Behind them in the distance was the unmistakable shape of a wedding arch. The authorities sealed the site within days, citing contamination from old building materials. But Daniel Price, Rowe's assistant, refused to accept the official explanation. He began compiling his own report, combining newspaper archives, census data, and family records. What he found was deeply unsettling. 3 couples in the surrounding villages had married on June 14th, every 20 years since the massacre. And in each case, one member of the pair had died within a month of the wedding. cause of death listed as natural or undetermined. Price traced the bloodlines. 2 of the victims shared a surname, Whitmore. The link was undeniable. Somehow, the descendants of the original family were still entwined in the same curse or covenant. Price's final journal entry, dated June 10, 1994, reads, "The pact was not broken. It was passed down through lineage, sealed in blood, renewed every century. The wedding was never a ceremony. It was an offering." He disappeared 3 days later. His car was found abandoned near the same site as Rose, engine running, door open. Inside the glove box was a folded note containing the words, "The bell will sound again." For the next 2 decades, silence returned. The field grew wild. Trees swallowed the last visible traces of stone. But those who lived nearby spoke of strange events on misty nights. Faint music carried on the wind, lights flickering among the trees, footprints in soft soil that led nowhere. One farmer told a BBC radio host in 2010 that he saw people standing in his field one night, all dressed for a wedding. When the presenter laughed, the man replied quietly, they weren't standing. They were waiting. In 2013, the BBC's investigative series Echoes of England revisited the story, describing it as a mass delusion preserved by folklore. But one of the producers, Eleanor Fitch, reported strange interference during filming. Our sound equipment kept picking up low-frequency tones, rhythmic, almost like breathing. When we played it back, one of the engineers swore he heard voices. It sounded like a choir humming the wedding hymn. The episode never aired. A week later, the BBC Archives Department recorded a data error that wiped the entire segment from the servers. To this day, Episode 7, The Wedding Bell Mystery, remains missing from the public record. And then, on June 14, 2013, precisely 120 years after the original massacre, something happened. At 12:01 p.m., dozens of residents across southern England reported hearing a faint bell tolling from the sky. The sound lasted exactly 13 seconds. Mobile phones within the area simultaneously lost signal. Later that evening, a couple was reported missing from their home near High Meadow, roughly 15 miles from the Millersville site. Their names were Edward and Clara Whitmore. They had been married that morning. The police found their house in perfect order. Dinner was laid on the table. A wedding photograph sat on the mantelpiece. In the image, the couple stood before a small crowd of guests, smiling. But behind them, in the far distance, a faint figure could be seen, dressed in black, face obscured, holding what appeared to be a small bell. The photo was analyzed extensively. Experts concluded the image was likely a lighting anomaly. But others disagreed. An amateur historian named Lewis Gant, who had been researching the Whitmore lineage for years, claimed to recognize the figure. He compared it to a painting, a portrait recovered from a private collection in Surrey depicting the original bride, Margaret Whitmore, painted in 1892. The resemblance was exact. At this point, even skeptics began to acknowledge something deeply wrong in the pattern. Every 20 years, the sound of bells. Every century, a wedding. Each time, a disappearance. The cycle was precise, deliberate, ritualistic. And now, the date of the next centennial recurrence loomed ahead. The year 2093 was far off, but the year 2033, the next 20-year interval, was closer than anyone wished to imagine. One final event closes this chapter. In 2015, hikers exploring woodland near the old Millersville field found a weathered gravestone half buried in moss. It bore no name, only an inscription. Until the bell calls again, the stone was later removed by authorities. No one knows where it was taken, but for those who live within that quiet stretch of countryside, there's an unspoken understanding. No weddings are held in June, no bells are rung at noon. And when mist settles over the fields, the locals stay indoors, because if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it, a low, distant tolling, faint but steady, as if echoing through time itself. the bell of Millersville, and somewhere, someone is waiting to answer it. By 2019, the story of Millersville had become an internet legend, a curiosity shared on forums, podcasts, and fringe history sites. Most treated it as fiction, a creepypasta disguised as Victorian folklore, but one journalist didn't. Jonathan Hale, a senior reporter for the Chronicle Review, specialized in historical investigations. When a series of archived BBC field recordings from 1993 were declassified under the Public Record Act, Hale noticed something odd among the usual broadcast notes: weather updates, shipping forecasts. One file was simply marked Audio Interference 140693, Hampshire, redacted. The recording lasted exactly 13 seconds. It was silent for the first 4. Then faintly came the sound of distant bells, slow, deliberate, metallic. At the 9th second, a woman's voice could be heard whispering 3 words, "We remember still." Then the tape cut to static. Hale was no believer in the paranormal. He'd exposed hoaxes, debunked myths, and written scathing columns on folk hysteria. But the precision of the audio, the date, the location, the recurring pattern was undeniable. He began retracing the Millersville story from the ground up: parish archives, census records, ministry files. The deeper he went, the more resistance he met. Government responses were delayed or denied. The British Library's historical maps showed the area as private, agricultural land. Requests for access were rejected. For reasons of preservation, it was as if Millersville had been erased twice, first by tragedy, then by bureaucracy. Then, by chance, Hale received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into 4. On it, typed in faded ink, were coordinates, and a phrase beneath, "For those who listen." The location led him to a storage compound in Kent, a facility for retired civil records. There, behind rows of neglected filing cabinets, he found a box marked Project Covenant Restricted. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten reports dated between 1953 and 1977. Each document referenced an entity known as the Ministry of Anomalous Research, Section C. Its focus: temporal and psychological disturbances associated with communal rites in defunct English parishes. Millersville was listed as Case File 201. The earliest report, from 1953, described the discovery of localized sonic phenomena resembling wedding bells at the abandoned site. Scientists measured the vibrations as seismic in nature, originating not from the air, but from beneath the earth. Another file referenced Project Covenant, a classified study initiated in 1954 to investigate the persistence of acoustic events linked to ancestral oaths. Its summary read, Hypothesis: the so-called Blood Pact of Millersville represents not folklore, but a continuing resonance, a biological memory encoded through generational ritual repetition. Hale wasn't sure what that meant until he read the attached medical records. They contained blood samples from various descendants of the Whitmore line. The notes beside them were chillingly precise. All subjects exhibit identical anomalies in iron content and cellular regeneration rate. Rhythmic pulse irregularities match the 13-second resonance interval observed at the Millersville site. In other words, the curse was measurable. The more Hale read, the more the pattern emerged. Every time the bell was heard, the same things followed: missing persons, unrecorded ceremonies, gaps in data. The files suggested that Project Covenant wasn't just studying the phenomenon, it was containing it. The ministry's goal, it seemed, was to prevent further recurrences. They did so by intercepting and eliminating evidence, researchers, journalists, and anyone who came too close. Among the names listed under neutralized contacts were Dr. Edward Harland, Clara Densmore, and Dr. Amelia Rowe. The final file, dated 1979, contained a photograph. It showed a rural field, empty, overgrown, but in the lower corner, partially cropped, was a structure resembling an altar. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, were 3 words: "The soil remembers." Hale published his first expose online under the title, "The Bloodline of Silence." Within hours, it was removed. Within days, Hale's account was suspended, his email wiped, and his home ransacked. Though police found no signs of forced entry, his last recorded phone call, made to his editor, ended abruptly mid-sentence. The audio was later recovered. "I think they've been moving it, the church or what's left of it. They're not trying to bury the past. But the call ended with a faint sound, a bell tolling once, soft but distinct. 3 weeks later, Hale was found in a roadside ditch near the Hampshire border. His body was intact, but his hands were clasped together, palms cut, dried blood forming a perfect ring between them. The coroner ruled the death natural causes due to shock. No investigation followed. After his death, Hale's files were acquired by a whistleblower who leaked fragments to an encrypted forum for journalists. Among the documents was a memo from 2003, decades after Project Covenant was supposedly dissolved. It bore the letterhead of the Home Office, Department of Cultural Preservation, but the signature at the bottom was different. Section C, Covenant Division. The memo referenced an ongoing initiative to transfer remaining artifacts to secure locations pending reactivation. And one line stood out. Primary object currently stored beneath Site 7, Hampshire Sector. Scheduled auditory test, 14/06/2023. A test, if accurate. That meant the government wasn't merely observing the Millersville phenomenon, they were replicating it. To what end? No one knew. A year later, in June 2020, a man claiming to be a former technician from Section C contacted an independent podcast called Unspoken Histories. He spoke under the pseudonym Martin. When asked about the bell, he said only, "It's not a sound. It's a memory. When it rings, it's not calling the dead. It's reminding the living." The episode was uploaded on 14th of June, exactly 30 years after the 1993 incident. Within 12 hours, the recording was deleted from every platform. But copies survived in the background of Martin's voice, faintly. The audience could hear it again, the low hum of a bell tolling 13 times. That was 3 years ago. Now, in 2023, the date listed in the memo approaches. Somewhere in the quiet countryside of Hampshire, beneath soil that once held a church, a government vault awaits activation, and the descendants of Margaret Whitmore, though unaware of their heritage, are living ordinary lives. They marry, they work, they sleep peacefully until the bell tolls again. When it does, history suggests the same pattern will return. One wedding, one disappearance, and one more addition to the Blood Pact of Millersville. By June of 2023, almost no one remembered Millersville. The name existed only on old maps and in half-erased records, a curiosity for local historians and paranormal enthusiasts. But beneath the quiet hills of Hampshire, deep inside a disused government facility, a chamber lay waiting, and the countdown had already begun. The official documents refer to it as Site 7, though internally it was called the Chamber. Built during the Cold War, it had once been a military listening post, later repurposed by an unnamed division within the ministry. Its purpose was simple: to monitor acoustic anomalies across southern England. In the spring of 2023, a new order was issued, Activate Resonance Trial, Covenant 01. The file was signed by an unknown official, initials MW. The chamber was circular, lined with copper panels and sound-dampening glass. At its center stood an ancient stone, cracked, weathered, engraved with words worn almost to dust. Sanguis promittit memoriam, blood, promises, remembrance. Wires ran from the stone to a modern control console. At 11:47 a.m. on June 14, 2023, technicians began transmitting low-frequency pulses through it, an attempt to measure residual resonance. They didn't understand what they were measuring. At exactly noon, Every monitor went dark. Security footage from the control room shows a flicker, lights dimming, alarms briefly sounding. Then for 13 seconds, total silence. When sound returned, the audio logs captured a faint ringing, deep, metallic, echoing from within the stone itself. And then, voices. They spoke in unison, overlapping, male and female together, each repeating a single phrase, "We remember still." The recording ends abruptly, but fragments of internal reports, leaked months later, describe what happened next. Personnel exhibited mass catatonia. Subjects 3 through 7 found clasping hands, palms cut. No external wounds. Air temperature in chamber dropped to 4 degrees C. Seismic sensors registered rhythmic pulses consistent with human heartbeats, 13 per minute. Sustained for 13 minutes. When responders entered, the chamber was empty. The technicians were gone. Only the stone remained, now warm to the touch, faintly glowing from within. And on the floor, drawn in blood, was the shape of a ring. News of the event never reached the public. Officially, the facility was decommissioned after equipment failure and contamination, but residents of nearby villages reported something else that day. At exactly noon, the church bells rang across Hampshire, though most of the churches had long since fallen silent. One local vicar later swore that his tower's ropes moved on their own. He described the sound as beautiful and wrong at the same time. 3 days later, a video appeared online. It was uploaded anonymously to a small paranormal YouTube channel under the title The Bell of the Forgotten Town. The footage showed a young woman in wedding attire walking through mist toward an unseen building. Her face was pale, distant, her veil fluttering in slow motion. Behind her, faintly, a crowd followed, blurred figures in Victorian dress. The final frame zoomed in, just enough to reveal the woman's eyes. They were open, unblinking, fixed directly on the camera. In the reflection, a man could be seen holding it, wearing a ministry security uniform. The video vanished within an hour, but in that brief window, nearly 10,000 people saw it. Many who watched reported hearing faint bells in the background, continuing even after the video ended. Among those who saw it was Emma Whitmore, a 28-year-old teacher from Bristol. She didn't know her family history, only that her great-grandmother had been from somewhere near Winchester. 2 days after watching the video, she vanished. Her flat was found undisturbed. Her laptop still displayed the paused frame of the woman in the wedding dress. Police recovered fingerprints from the keyboard. They matched Emma's and someone else's. A near-perfect match to 19th century samples of Margaret Whitmore. Preserved in university archives since 1954, that discovery should have been impossible. But DNA analysis confirmed a shared maternal line. It was as if the blood itself had not aged, as if the promise Margaret made at the altar continued through every generation, whispering beneath the skin. In the months that followed, scattered incidents appeared across southern England, bells ringing where no churches stood, couples disappearing after small private weddings, witnesses describing music without instruments, drifting across empty fields. Each event occurred on the 14th day of the month, each at exactly noon, each lasting 13 seconds. In September 2023, the ministry sealed Site 7 permanently. Or so they claimed. A private contractor who helped dismantle the structure later described what he saw inside. The chamber was gone, just an empty pit. But the air, it felt alive, like breathing through someone else's lungs. When asked if he heard anything, he hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. A bell, but it wasn't ringing. It was listening. The final known reference to the Millersville phenomenon appears in an internal Home Office memo dated October 31st, 2023. It reads, "Subject has transcended containment. Blood resonance continues through generational inheritance. All future observations suspended indefinitely. Let the soil keep its memory." The document was signed simply, "MW today, Millersville remains absent from maps." No memorial marks the site. No plaque recalls the wedding that ended a town. But sometimes, on quiet summer days, hikers in the Hampshire countryside report hearing it, a faint echo rolling over the hills, not loud, not near, just enough to remind them they are not alone. And for those who listen carefully, the sound is not of mourning, but of celebration, a ceremony beginning again, an oath renewing itself, for in Millersville nothing truly ended. The promise remains, and the bell still waits to be answered.